This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour, and welcome to Unique Scotland, the podcast from my website Exclusive Scottish Visits that brings this wonderful country to you, wherever you may be. My first two podcasts discussed Scotland the place and Scotland the people, and that was to try to give you a baseline before heading off into the hills and glens to see Scotland for yourself. And my last three podcasts were a tour trilogy from Edinburgh all the way up to Inverness and back, calling in to some wonderful places like St Andrews, Dunkeld, and down to Loch Ness, where you heard about my own sightings of the Loch Ness Monster. This podcast is going to tell you about the customs and traditions of Scotland. For example, why would an enormous, hairy, kilted Scotsman want to pick up a tree trunk and throw it across a field? And what would possess him to do exactly the same to a haggis? And if you're still not sure what a haggis is, well, I'll be letting you into the secret. Where does the kilt come from? And where did tartan originate? I'll touch on our traditional music and the dances that go with it, and we'll pop into a ceilidh and join an island community for a fun evening. I should just remind you that I do have a blog on my website at exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk that does have photographs of many of the places we'll be talking about over the coming days, so please do refer to that gallery if you wish. I will also be doing a video podcast once a month, so you will get to see more of the places I discuss. Once more, from a link on my website at exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. So, this audio podcast is going to tell you about the customs and traditions of Scotland that have come to identify the Scots as a race apart. We'll go on a short tour and take in the Highland Games, look at kilts and perhaps listen to some Scottish music, including of course the bagpipes, but not too much. We'll also drop into the towns that provide us with some of the best of Scottish fare. There's a wee town called Cullen, for example, where the Cullen skink is a speciality. Sounds a bit odd, but after you've tasted Cullen skink, you will not look back. It's going to be a great trip that builds upon your unique Scotland experience. I hope you're relaxing at home, walking or jogging in the park, or just chilling in your favourite place. So let me bring Scotland, its customs and traditions, to you for the next 30 minutes. And if you're relaxing, enjoying a wee dram of the amber nectar perhaps, then slán je va. The tartan kilt, the national dress of Scotland. It's probably the most iconic symbol of a Scot and is recognised throughout the world. I'm always surprised and yet delighted at the reaction of people, especially women, on seeing a kilted Scotsman, and it tickles me that you ladies seem to get real pleasure from the sight. I wear the kilt for at least 6 months of the year, mainly when showing my guests around my lovely Scotland, and it never fails. Whether it's at the airport and cameras have to be retrieved from deep recesses of suitcases to get that first shot, or a coachload of tourists at a beauty spot where I may be the only one sporting a kilt. There seems to be a rush to get that image of Scottishness onto the camera, or more often these days the iPhone. And if I'm with guests, and they are happy to lose me for a few moments, I'm always pleased to have my photograph taken with tourists who are kind enough to ask. Of course, some do not, and I'm smiling to myself now when I think of the lengths some will go to have a kilted Scotsman in their photo albums. To me, the funniest is what I call the crab walk. I'm normally in front of my guests, they are facing me, listening intently, well I hope they are, sharing with them some aspect of history or such like, but suddenly I can see out of the corner of my eye a tourist slowly sliding or side-walking like a crab towards me. When they're right alongside me, and I'm still ignoring them, a head pops up from behind my guests, then a camera, and then the shot. The photo having been taken, the tourist alongside me then crab walks slowly away as if nothing had happened. And don't get me talking about selfie sticks either. Anyway, where does this Scottish dress come from? Well, the origins of kilt wearing in Scotland are really lost in the mists of time, but there is some thought the kilt is loosely based on the Roman soldier's tunic, those very same Romans who were in Britain in the 1st to the 3rd century that I talked about in my podcast Scotland a People. The wearing of a type of skirt by men in southern Europe has been the norm for hundreds of years, and one has just to look at the traditional dress of Greece to see that today. The difference with the Scots attire is that our dresses, or kilts, are made of thick wool and are coloured in stripes, giving us the tartan pattern that also allows you to differentiate between the clans. Whatever the reality, and whenever it emerged as the Highlander style of dress, the kilt is in fact very practical in combating the type of weather to be found in Scotland, where it can rain occasionally. But the kilt's tight weave and the natural oils in the wool provide a strong barrier to the wet and the cold. And it was easier to make. When it was woven, it came straight from the weaver's loom and was 5 feet wide, just under 2 metres, and then cut into strips of 21 feet, which is just under 7 metres. And instead of having to cut and sew it into trousers, you just wrap the plaid around you, and there you have it. The standard kilt was the philibeg, or the small kilt, worn around the waist, and the phillimore was the big kilt, and was 2 small kilts stitched together, and used as you see in Braveheart and Outlander films, with the upper part thrown over the shoulder and kept in place by a brooch. The advantage of the big kilt was that it was used as day wear, but could also be used as a blanket at night. And as it happens, the Gaelic word plaid means blanket. And I can think of nothing more romantic than sleeping under the stars in the Scottish mountains on a soft bed of heather wrapped snugly in your phillimore. The word plaid and tartan often get confused. I've noticed, for example, my American guests use the word plaid as the type of tartan pattern on the kilt, but as I've just mentioned, plaid really means the whole piece of cloth, or the blanket. Tartan is the word we use for the striped pattern of the kilt. So today's kilt that you see has an illustrious history, but this smaller version, the philibeg, only appeared in the late 17th and 18th century, and in reality was only worn by Highlanders or the Highland regiments, while the Lowlanders wore tartan trousers, or trews as they were known. The kilt was actually banned after the Jacobite defeat at Culloden in 1746, and that ban was not lifted until 1814. However, the kilt never really came into vogue until 20 years later, during the state visit of King George IV to Scotland, the first monarch to visit in nearly 200 years, who invited the clan chiefs to attend in Highland dress. At that time, textile manufacturers developed a brilliant marketing strategy by linking specific tartan sets in a weave to families or areas, and with new weaving technology, these could be mass-produced. Today there's about 4,000 different tartans, and if you have a particular tartan in mind, you can order your own and have a kilt made from it. I'm often asked the difference between the modern and ancient tartans. Well, in simple terms, the modern kilt is made by using colours from chemical dyes, and the ancient kilts are made from natural herb and plant dyes. So what makes up a Scotsman's kilted attire today? Well, during the day, and starting at the bottom, he'll normally be wearing sturdy shoes or brogues, with long woolen socks kept up by coloured garters. In the right-hand sock you'll find a scian dhu, which is a small dagger, and the direct translation from Gaelic is scian, knife, and dhu, black, or black knife, which actually means hidden knife, and relates back to dangerous times when carrying a weapon for self-protection was essential. Normally Highlanders would always be pretty heavily armed, with a sword, a dirk, or long dagger, and both worn in the sword belt, but he'd also have a scian dhu or short dagger hidden on his person, under the armpit for example. When invited to someone's house or castle, it was customary to leave any weapons at the entrance, but knowing how vulnerable a person felt in those days without a weapon, the host would usually allow his guest to retain one small weapon, and the scian dhu was brought from its hiding place and put into the top of the sock so everybody could see it. Then the kilt itself. If it was a philibeg, a small kilt, then it's fitted around the waist with a kilt belt and buckle. The kilt side would then be closed and secured by a kilt pin. My own kilt pin, for example, is shaped as a sword with the insignia of my clan, Clan Mackay, shown on the hilt, and this is a hand clasping a dagger and the words man forte, or strong hand. If it was a phillimore, a large kilt, then the individual would have to lay the material on the floor with the belt underneath the material, then lie down onto it and start to gather pleats around the lower part. Once the lower half was closed, The individual would then stand up and place the extra material around the waist and over the shoulder, fixing the plaid at the breast with a brooch. Today's small kilt is generally worn with a plain shirt, a tweed waistcoat and a Prince Charlie jacket, with deer antler buttons and normally fancy embroidery on the shoulders and the cuffs. And finally, the sporran, or leather pouch, which is attached to a narrow leather belt at the front of the kilt. This leather bag used to contain a Highlander's oatmeal, which would provide him with sustenance on his forays into the hills. Today, it contains my mobile phone. It's a similar principle, I suppose, but in this instance, I just need to make a quick phone call to get my oats. The only thing missing from this kilted Highland specimen is a set of bagpipes. Well, I hope you're all not too disappointed when I tell you that we all don't play bagpipes. I'd love to, but you must have good lungs, an ability to blow up balloons, and strong eardrums. However, you can't get away from it. Bagpipes are Scotland's national instrument, and every visit to Scotland should include a rendition of the swirling pipes. Now, this could be the solitary tourist piper in Edinburgh's Royal Mile, or the massed pipe bands on display at the Edinburgh's Military Tattoo. The noise can either scare the hell out of you, or, if it's a beautiful lament, could bring a tear to your eye. So, what are bagpipes, and where do they come from? Well, in simple terms, the part of the bagpipe that makes the melodious sound is known as the chanter, which is a wooden type of flute, and that really is the only way I can describe it. It's attached to a bag of sheep or deer skin, with 3 pipes that rise out of the instrument, which emit the sound. Now you have to blow the bag up to prime it, then keep blowing, and the air in the bag flows through the chanter where the musical notes are made. The bag acts as a sort of air reservoir to ensure that the chanter is always primed and keeps the music flowing smoothly. The origins are once more sketchy, but it's believed that the bagpipe we know and love came from the Middle East and as far back as the 1st century. It's suggested that Nero could play a type of reed pipe fed by air from a bladder beneath his armpit, and that seems to fit the bill. There does not, however, appear to be any real evidence of bagpipes in Scotland before the 14th century. One of the first uses, apparently, of bagpipes on Scottish soil comes from French history, which records that at the Battle of Pinkie, and that's a small town near Edinburgh, in 1547, between the Scots and the English, the Scots were using bagpipes instead of trumpets to muster their men. Since then, bagpipes have been used on many battlefields. They were used because they could be heard above the noise and carnage, the rattle of musketry, gunfire and the roar of the cannon. It ensured that soldiers remained aware of the position of the centre of their regiment, and bagpipes have been shown on many occasions to have a dramatic effect on soldiers, as witnessed in the trench warfare in the First and Second World War. Just before going over the top of the trench, the nerves must have been jangling, but when the bagpipe started up, the adrenaline would flow, giving a boost to the waiting soldiers who readily went over the top to face the enemy. Today there are many professional pipe bands all over Scotland, and most Highland regiments will have their own band. There are also pipe bands all over the world, many formed by the Scottish diaspora, especially in America, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. And during the era of the British Empire, the Scottish regiments would have had pipers, which may well have encouraged British colonies to adopt this iconic instrument. The National Piping Centre of Scotland can be found in Glasgow, and I have had the privilege of dining there with a good friend who is also an excellent piper. The evening was superb. Haggis was eaten, and whisky was drunk, and of course we were entertained by some of the best pipe music I have ever heard, and I have attended the World Piping Championships. But on this evening, the piping was by massed pipers in the hall, where we were having dinner, which was quite extraordinary. However, it did play havoc with my eardrums, which were still ringing for days to come, but it was an amazing memory all the same. There's no doubt about it, the pipes stir exhilarating emotions, and wherever you are in the world, the sound will always bring back memories of the glens and lochs of Scotland. So where can you guarantee to see bagpipes in Scotland, played by professional musicians? I've mentioned the Royal Military Tattoo, and more of that shortly, but if you're in Scotland between May and September, you should try to catch one of the most traditional Scottish events in the summer calendar, the Highland Games. They can be found in towns all over Scotland. There are about 80 different venues, and we will look in on the games at Braemar, or the Gathering as it's called locally, and attended every year by Her Majesty the Queen, who's normally holidaying at Balmoral Castle at that time of year. The gathering is always held on the first Saturday of September. Balmoral Castle is a large estate house in Aberdeenshire, known as Royal Deeside, and is only 15 minutes' drive to Braemar. It has been in the royal family since 1852, when Queen Victoria and her husband Prince Albert bought the estate. The short drive to Braemar follows an old military road along the course of the River Dee. You can now start to see the connection with Deeside and Aberdeen. Well, it's a lovely drive with fir trees lining part of the route and the river visible for most of the way, and a backdrop of mountains as you drive through the Cairngorms National Park. On arrival at Braemar, the most striking thing is just how pretty the town is, with its neat stone walls and 19th century granite-built cottages. And on the day of the gathering, the crowds swell, and there's a well-organised route to the main arena. Parking is fairly easy, and a 10-minute walk later, we'll be at the grounds and enter a large arena with stands on every side. The royal enclosure is a very posh large tent, and will seat Her Majesty and invited dignitaries. The arena, a large grassed area in the centre, is set up with running tracks, dancing platforms, high bars, and all the equipment that will be used as competitors pit their strengths against each other. It's just possible that Braemar is responsible for the introduction of the Highland Games in the 11th century, because the first recorded competitive event in Scotland was when King Malcolm III summoned men to become his royal messenger. The individual was chosen after a contest to find the fastest runner in Scotland. This contest was for the men to race up the mountain Crag Conich, which overlooks Braemar. There's also later evidence in the 17th and 18th centuries of clan gatherings where their strongest would compete against each other, which to my mind was preferable to the deadly pitched battles that often resolve disputes. But in reality, the modern Highland Games we see today, albeit with historical precedent, were invented during the 19th century, Victorian times, when the Scots were rediscovering their roots. I'd also like to mention in passing that Scottish societies formed by the Scottish diaspora worldwide do hold their own Highland Games in their countries, and these can be of considerable size, and if there are any members of those societies listening today, then do get in touch through my website exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk and tell me about it. Well, today's visit to Braemar Gathering will enthrall us with a large number of traditional games. The normal format of the games includes heavy events, Highland dancing, pipe bands and speed events. I mentioned the hairy kilted Scotsman earlier and his wish to pick up a tree trunk and throw it across a field. Well, this is probably one of the best known events at the Highland Games, and it's called tossing the caber. To toss is to throw, and a caber is Gaelic for a wooden beam made from the larch tree. As far as size is concerned, the caber should typically be 19 feet 6 inches, which is just under 6 metres tall, and weigh about 175 pounds or 79 kilograms. In effect, the competitor picks up the the caber, and tries to throw it end over end, and as straight as possible from his position, so 12 o'clock from where he is standing. The one closest to 12 o'clock wins, and if no one throws the caber end over end, then the highest angle achieved is the winner. The strength and power to achieve this is quite incredible, and I would certainly not wish to get on the wrong side of one of these guys. Other heavy events include the stone putt, which is throwing a standard size rounded stone to see who throws it the furthest, not dissimilar from shot put in athletic competitions today. Then there's the Scottish hammer throw, a heavy metal ball attached to a 4-foot wooden handle. Another event is the weight throwing, which is effectively a 56-pound weight with a handle. But the one I really like to watch is the weight over the bar throwing, which is the same 56-pound weight, but it has to be thrown over a high jump bar using only one hand. To finish off the heavy events, I have to mention the haggis throwing. This is where even I, not known for my muscle and brawn, can participate, and volunteers will come out of the crowd to compete. Simple competition is where the one with the longest throw wins, and if the haggis can still run afterwards, then you can gain more points. Now, for those who have not listened to my recent podcast on Scotland the People, and are still wondering what a haggis is, well, it's a small, fat, brown, hairless animal with tiny ears and a face like a pig. And this animal is an amazing creature with 2 legs on the right-hand side which are shorter than the 2 legs on the left-hand side to make it easier to run in straight lines around a mountain. The only problem with this, of course, is that it can only run in a clockwise direction. Now, my Granny Mushet used to say that the best way to catch a haggis was to sneak up behind it on a hill, give it a fright, and when it suddenly turned around with its short legs on the wrong side, it would simply fall over. Anyway, it is wonderful to eat, and I'll let you into the secret of how it's prepared later in the podcast. Other events will include our running competitions. There's a competition to climb up the nearest hill as fast as you can and back down again. And there's also Highland dancing competitions, where children as young as 6 or 7 years old will be beautifully dressed in Highland kilts, dancing in unison, with their arms held high, kilts swirling, and moving swiftly to the beat of their bagpipes. There are sheepdog competitions, with farmers pitting the skills of their dogs against others to see who can control a small herd of sheep into a pen. Then there's tug-of-war between the professional competitors, and also an opportunity for observers to take part in the open competition. And, of course, all entertained by massed pipes and drums. It's a fantastic day out, and I was lucky enough to visit Braemar Highland Games a couple of years ago, when Her Majesty the Queen was in attendance. And for all the lucky winners on the day, they received their medals from the Queen herself. I mentioned the other event where you will be privileged to see the massed pipes and drums, and that is at the Edinburgh Royal Military Tattoo. It is spectacular and conducted right in front of the castle on what is known as the Esplanade, or the open area of approach to the castle entrance, and it's been going on since the 1950s. The term tattoo comes from the 17th century Dutch phrase tap toe, which was a drum roll played by the regimental corps of drums each night to tell landlords of alehouses to turn off their taps so that soldiers would return to their barracks. The tattoo is a series of marches, music and skilled events involving the British Armed Forces, the Commonwealth and international military bands. There are artistic performance teams, precision marching teams, and normally a battle scene relevant to a particular time performed by military personnel. There will be Highland dancing teams, and I was a very proud father a few years ago now, watching my son taking part in a Highland dance routine at the tattoo when his school, Queen Victoria School Dunblane, was asked to perform with their pipe band and dancers. Nowadays, modern technology is used, and a sonolumiere is projected onto the facade of the castle, and there'll also be fireworks to add to the spectacle. But at the end, the whole company of pipers and performers march out of the castle entrance, down the esplanade, and stop in front of the royal box to salute the senior dignitary attending that evening. However, the final pièce de résistance is the lone piper, who stands in the battlements of the castle with all lights extinguished and a single searchlight shining upon this lonely figure, and the lament that's played will bring tears to your eyes. I'd now like to turn to other Scottish music and the type of instruments that will be heard at folk events and dances, which in Scotland are called ceilidhs. The word ceilidh, which is spelled C-E-I-L-I-D-H-S, in English simply means visit, and this best sums up how it originated as a social visit, with neighbours gathering in one place on the long dark winter nights to recite poems, stories of the day and of the past. And this verbal storytelling was very important in isolated communities, in recalling legendary feats, including their heroes and ancient beliefs of the past. Musical instruments would play a big part in this, and some people would sing. There'd be dancing and undoubtedly tasting of the local distilled whisky. It is interesting that in the more remote communities in Scotland, such as the far northern Highlands and the Islands, some of these traditions still pertain, and children will be encouraged to take up one of the more traditional instruments and will normally have a chance to show their skills at a gathering such as a feish, which is a traditional Gaelic arts and cultural festival. I attended one last year on the island of Mull, and children from all around came along to be introduced to 2 musical instruments over a weekend. Children who had never seen a set of bagpipes had a go, and there was a terrific concert on the final day in the community hall. It amazes me that nearly all my cousins on the island of Mull can play piano, accordion and the bagpipes, and to a high standard. Today, the ceilidh is more of a social gathering. There is less of the storytelling, and more of the Scottish music, and a few drams of the amber nectar. You may have heard of such dances as the Gay Gordons or the Eightsome Reel. Well, these are typical dances at these events. This will be held in a house or a hotel, or in the local village hall, and the instruments played will be the guitar, accordion, bagpipes, drums, flutes, and even sometimes a harp. Well, the tradition continues today throughout Scotland, and when visiting Scotland you can experience a ceilidh in most towns. But I still love visiting the islands of Skye and Mull for a more authentic version of this occasion. You don't really need a reason to hold one either, and they're no longer reserved for the long winter nights. On some islands, for example, there's a ceilidh after the summer holidays, on the evening before the children go back to school. I've attended a few, and there always used to be a non-alcoholic policy within the hall. However, it made me smile when occasionally small groups of men would leave the hall for about 5 minutes and return together. I was once invited to join one small group, and as we left, as inconspicuously as possible, not a word was said. When we got outside, we were invited into a camper van and sat around in silence. Small glasses full of whisky were passed around, and at the appropriate moment we all raised our glasses, said Slàinte, drunk the whisky and left the van, filing back into the ceilidh as if nothing had happened. As I said, when you visit Scotland, experiencing a ceilidh is a must, and don't worry about not being able to do the dances. There will always be a caller in charge of the music, and once you've taken your partner, you'll be walked through the routine. It does not take long to pick up the steps, and even if it does, part of the fun is for those who know the dances will shuffle you in the right direction to complete the dance. It's an absolute hoot, and at the end of the evening you will have been well and truly entertained. I now want to turn to the traditional food of Scotland. Firstly, I suppose I'm going to have to come clear on haggis, as it is the national dish. No, it's not a wee animal running clockwise around a mountain. It was actually a meal for the poor in medieval times. The higher echelons of society ate the meat, and the poor were given the offal. So it's made from heart, liver, lungs, all minced with onion, oatmeal, spices, and traditionally encased in a sheep's stomach. It's then boiled, and then it's cut open to eat the meat inside. Some of my guests from abroad come with the idea that you're eating a sheep's stomach, but I have to explain that that is the receptacle for the meat, and once the meat's cooked, you cut it open and take the meat out. It's normally served with neeps and tatties, and that's simply boiled turnip and potatoes, and it's all mashed up. Haggis, once you've tasted it, it's lovely. Sometimes a very small amount of whisky poured over it gives it just that little extra kick. To be fair, haggis is not eaten very often, although I notice that restaurants do have it on the menu more regularly these days in meals such as Balmoral chicken, which is a chicken breast with haggis stuffed inside, and that's very nice indeed. Also, you'll find local fish and chip shops selling deep-fried haggis, and while I'm talking about chip shops, deep-fried Mars bars as well. Not a fan of either myself, but it's a personal taste. Another traditional dish is called finnan haddie. It's a cold smoked haddock from Aberdeenshire, and it's smoked with green wood and peat. The origin is debatable, but there's a lovely story of how by chance the meal was discovered. It has been suggested that a fire in a fish curing house near Findon burned barrels of curing haddock. It was thought the stock was wasted until someone tasted the fish in the barrels and discovered that it had not been burned, but had been smoked and was rather nice. And staying on the theme of finnan haddie, I want to turn now to the meal called Cullen skink. The town of Cullen is on the northeast coast of Scotland between Inverness and Aberdeen. The entry sign to the town says, "Welcome to Cullen, home of the Cullen skink." It's a small town of about 1,500 inhabitants, sitting right on the Moray Firth, with a long sandy bay and an amazing Victorian viaduct bringing the train line into the town. Cullen skink is a thick soup made of smoked haddock, and the authentic dish is supposed to use finnan haddie. It's made by boiling smoked haddock, potatoes and onion in a fish stock. Some use milk or single cream instead of water, and that gives it a creamy texture you'll often find in restaurants. And some mash the potatoes to make the soup thicker. Whatever way it's made, it's a meal in itself, and one of my favourites for lunch. Some of my American guests call it a fish chowder, but find it smokier than their own equivalent, and my French guests find it heavier than their bisque. Come further south of Aberdeen, just north of Dundee, and you'll find a coastal town called Arbroath. Its speciality is the Arbroath smoky. It's also a type of smoked haddock, although prepared differently from the Finnan haddie. In 2004, the European Union gave the fish name protected status, and for that name to appear anywhere else in the world, the fish must have been prepared in Arbroath. Of course, I do have to mention porridge, a typical Scottish meal and normally eaten at breakfast time. Certainly as a child, that was the staple diet before going off to school in the morning. Its slow release of energy made it a perfect filler for energetic children. And I also let you into the secret earlier of what used to be found in a Scotsman's sporran, which is wee leather pouch worn with a kilt, or the man bag of yesteryear. And that was oats, which the Highlander could simply mix with water, and he had a hearty and healthy meal to keep him going for the rest of the day. I could go on, but if you're interested in Scottish fare, you're going to have to buy my cookery book, which will be written once I've received enough requests, so don't hold your breath. Before I end the traditional food section, I'd like to mention the biscuit we all know and love, butter shortbread, which I know so many of you will have tasted, especially if you've flown British Airways and enjoyed one of their Walker's shortbread biscuits. And finally, I want to give you the recipe to the dessert sensation of this century, and that is cranachan. For me, it is sublime. And I looked this up in the Oxford Dictionary. The word sublime means of very great excellence, producing an overwhelming sense of awe or other high emotion. There's just no other way to describe it. And it's not difficult to make. You just take some raspberries, whip double cream, sugar, oats and whiskey, mix it into a thick creamy paste and put it into a glass. Add some more raspberries to the top and eat it lovingly. It is fabulous. Finally, I want to touch upon the traditional Scottish events in the calendar, and three that really stand out. The first is the Burns Supper, which is a celebration of the life and poetry of the Scottish poet Robert Burns. Suppers are held on his birthday of 25th of January, or any date near that within a couple of weeks. It can be quite formal, with most men in kilts and women in some sort of tartan dress. It's a sit-down meal, and takes the form of poetry readings and eating the traditional meal of haggis, neeps and tatties, with much whisky on the table. The haggis will normally be led into the dining room by a piper, and the chairman will invite one of the company to recite Robert Burns' famous ode or poem to a haggis. Now in this poem, Burns declares his love for the great chieftain o' the Puddin race, and he glorifies what was a poor man's food into a dish that's greater than any French ragout or fricassee. I think you get the gist. The second is St Andrew's Day, which marks the start of Scotland's winter festivals, which begins on the first Sunday after the 26th of November. Now St Andrew is the patron saint of Scotland, and gives his name to the town of St Andrews. The dinner of St Andrew's night is less formal than the Burns Supper, but good Scottish food and drink is consumed to celebrate our patron saint. And the final festival I wish to mention is Hogmanay. It's what we Scots call New Year's Eve, the big night that marks the arrival of the new year. This night is an outpouring of cheer for the year that is about to end, and the welcoming in of the new. The evening can be spent at home, with friends, or at a function where Scottish dancing and music will regale the party-goers into the small hours. On the stroke of midnight, everyone gets to kiss everyone else, and it's a real joyous occasion. Not surprisingly, there are customs and superstitions attached to this event. The one I remember at home was that if you were a fair-haired man, you had to carry a piece of coal with you after midnight, just in case you were the first foot, or the first person to call at a neighbour's house, as it was bad luck for a fair-haired person to cross the threshold first. No woman, certainly in my village, was ever allowed to be the first foot. You carried your own New Year bottle, as it was called, with you. Now that could be any alcoholic drink, not necessarily whisky, but you didn't leave it at the house as you would at a party, but you gave a drink to the people who you were visiting in that particular house, and then you always took your bottle with you on to the next house. I remember inviting a few of my good friends up from England on Hogmanay. After we visited the first house, we approached a second, and I asked where their bottles were, and they said they'd left them at the first house. So we returned and second-footed the house and could not leave until we had another dram, this time taking our bottles with us when we left. So there we have it, just some of the customs and traditions of Scotland. The kilt, the Highland Games, the tattoo, the haggis and much more, and all waiting for you when you come to visit these shores. Quite amazing when you think that Scotland is only half the size of New York State and only 5.5 million people. So I hope you're starting to get a feel for the uniqueness of this country and its people. The difference between the Highlands and the Islands, where customs and traditions are very much still alive, whereas the Lowlands have perhaps become more cosmopolitan, with a different type of Scottishness. Perhaps it was ever thus. But these are just my thoughts, and some of you may have a different opinion. Also, there are many more customs and traditions of Scotland, and certainly worthy of another podcast. And if you think I've left any really important ones out and are desperate to hear about them, then please just let me know. Well, I've spoken of my love of visiting the islands of Scotland, and it's to the islands I next turn my attention. And my next podcast is going to be a tour around the Isle of Skye. It's a large island with a population of about 10,000 people, but some amazing scenery and wonderful stories and places to visit, such as the Old Man of Storr, Kilt Rock, Dunvegan Castle, and Talisker Distillery. Well, I hope you're continuing to enjoy your unique Scotland journey, and if you wish to receive your next podcast automatically, please subscribe for free access to my podcasts on my website at exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. I very much look forward to you joining me next week on our tour of Skye, and wherever you are, stay well and stay safe. And I raise my glass to you. Slán Java.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.